When the sun was in the east, the shadow pointed east. And at that moment, I realized that the years I spent as a high school science teacher in Anchorage had not prepared me to understand or accept a fundamental problem with Denali's physics. During the 7 years I spent as a mountain ranger in Denali National Park, I had noticed small anomalies before. Moments when the shadow of the 20,000-foot summit fell at angles that didn't quite match the sun's position. Situations where climbers reported the shadow reaching them before the sun had moved into a position to cast it. However, I always explain these observations as simple facts. Optical illusions created by Alaska's extremely clear air, the games played by high altitude and low humidity on depth perception and sense of direction, and the simple fact that such a large mountain creates visual phenomena not seen in smaller geological features. But on March 15th of this year, as I stood at the 14,000-foot camp on the West Buttress route, watching the sunrise paint Denali's summit with alpenglow, its shadow stretched completely in the wrong direction over the Kahiltna Glacier. I could no longer find a logical explanation because the shadow was not receding from the sun. It was extending toward the sun, as if the mountain were casting darkness, not behind it, but in front of it, as if light and shadow had completely reversed their fundamental relationship in this particular place. If you've ever stood in a shadow and felt cold that went beyond the simple absence of sunlight, if you've ever sensed that darkness has weight and presence and maybe even intention, then you need to understand what I'm about to tell you about Mount Mckinley's shadow and what happens to people who spend too long inside it. Hit that like button right now because this isn't just a story about strange physics. It's documentation of a phenomenon that the Inupiat and Athabascan peoples have known about for thousands of years and tried to warn us about in legends we dismissed as superstition. Stories about the shadow that hunts, the darkness that takes pieces of people who wander into it unprepared, the thing that lives in the space between light and its absence and feeds on whatever makes humans human. My name is Nathan Cross, and before I became a mountaineering ranger, I spent 8 years teaching physics at a high school in Anchorage, which means I understand the basic principles that govern how light interacts with solid objects to create shadows, the geometric optics, the inverse square law of illumination, the simple fact that shadows fall opposite to light sources because that's what happens when an opaque object blocks electromagnetic radiation. These aren't complex concepts, they're fundamental to how reality operates, which is why Denali's shadow behaving incorrectly isn't just strange, but rather represents a violation of physics so basic that accepting it requires questioning whether we understand light and darkness at all, whether the rules we teach in classrooms apply everywhere, or whether there are places where different rules operate. Older rules, rules that predate human understanding and don't care whether we believe in them or not. The incident that made me realize how serious this phenomenon was happened 3 months ago in late December when winter darkness dominates Alaska. But the few hours of twilight create dramatic lighting conditions that make Denali's shadow particularly pronounced and particularly wrong. A climbing expedition of 4 experienced mountaineers, led by James Whitfield, a 43-year-old guide who'd summited Denali 11 times and knew the mountain as well as anyone alive, departed from the 14,000-foot camp at 6:47 a.m. to attempt a summit push during a weather window that forecasters had identified as ideal, clear skies and low winds, and temperatures that were brutal but manageable for properly equipped climbers. They were carrying satellite communication devices, following established routes, checking in at predetermined intervals, doing everything right in the way that experienced mountaineers do when they're attempting the tallest peak in North America in winter conditions that kill the unprepared with terrifying efficiency. Their first 3 check-ins came exactly on schedule: 8 a.m. at Washburn's Thumb, 9:30 a.m. at the fixed lines below Denali Pass, 11 a.m. at the football field just below the summit ridge, and then nothing. Complete silence that lasted until 3:15 p.m. when James's satellite device transmitted a brief message that read, shadow wrong, time wrong, coming down, don't understand what happened, followed by GPS coordinates that placed them at 16,000 feet, which should have been impossible because to return from near the summit to 16,000 feet in the time between their last check-in and this message would require descending 4,000 vertical feet in just over 4 hours. A pace that even in an emergency would be dangerously fast, but that 4 climbers moving together in winter conditions simply couldn't achieve without essentially falling down the mountain. We launched rescue protocols immediately, dispatching teams from the 14,000-foot camp to intercept them on their descent route, flying helicopter reconnaissance along the standard paths they should be taking down the west buttress, scanning with every optical and thermal detection system available to identify their position and assess their condition. But we couldn't find them, couldn't detect them anywhere on the routes they should be using, couldn't make contact via radio or satellite, despite their devices showing as powered on and transmitting GPS positions that placed them progressively lower on the mountain, but never in locations where visual confirmation was possible, always just out of sight, always in the shadow zones where the mountain blocked direct sunlight and created those patches of darkness that stretched across the glaciers and snowfields in directions that shouldn't be possible given solar position. They walked into base camp at 7:23 p.m., 8 hours after their last normal check-in and 4 hours after James's cryptic message about shadow and time being wrong, and when I first saw them in the illumination of camp lights, I thought we were looking at different people than the ones who departed that morning because they'd aged, visibly aged, in ways that made no sense for a 12-hour climbing day. James's beard, which had been dark brown, flecked with distinguished gray when he'd left, was now entirely white, and not the white of frost or ice accumulation, but the white of hair that had lost all pigmentation the way it does over years, not hours. The other 3 climbers showed similar changes. One had developed deep wrinkles around his eyes that hadn't been there that morning. Another had lost weight in his face that suggested weeks of inadequate nutrition rather than a single day of exertion. The third moved with the careful gait of someone whose joints had stiffened with age, even though he was only 31 years old. "What happened up there?" I demanded as the medical team began assessments that would later confirm what visual inspection had already suggested, that their bodies showed physiological markers consistent with having experienced significantly more time than the 12 hours that had elapsed on our clocks since their departure. "Your message said the shadow was wrong, the time was wrong. What did you encounter?" James looked at me with eyes that had seen something they couldn't process, something that had broken his understanding of reality the way my understanding had broken when I'd watched the shadow point toward the sun, and when he spoke his voice was hoarse like he'd been screaming or like he hadn't used it in a long time, longer than 12 hours, much longer. "We entered the shadow at the football field," he said slowly, each word seeming to cost him effort, like he was translating from a language that didn't have direct English equivalents. The shadow was pointing the wrong way toward the sun instead of away, and we thought it was an optical illusion, thought the altitude was affecting our perception, so we kept going because the summit was right there, 30 minutes away, and we'd come too far to turn back because of a weird shadow. Although he was currently at a relatively low altitude and had time to rest during the descent, he paused, breathing heavily. His breathing reflected stress more than exertion. His heart rate had increased and his breathing had quickened, as if he were still afraid of what they had experienced and its meaning. "Inside the shadow, it was different," he continued. "It wasn't exactly cold or just cold, but it was as if the air had been sucked out, as if we were in a vacuum, yet we could still breathe, as if the normal substance of reality had been drained away and replaced with something thinner. And time flowed differently. We could feel it flowing at the wrong speed, faster than it should have been, as if every second passed like a minute, or maybe every minute passed like a second. I couldn't tell which way the distortion was going, but I knew it wasn't right. I knew we were experiencing a duration that didn't match our movements or thoughts. The medical reports confirmed temporal displacement, which isn't supposed to be a real medical diagnosis because time doesn't work that way, doesn't pass at different rates for people in proximity to each other under normal conditions, and yet their cellular markers, their hair growth, their metabolic indicators all suggested they'd experienced approximately 6 days of biological time during the 4 hours they'd been inside the shadow zone, 6 days without adequate food or water or rest. 6 days of exposure and exertion that their bodies had endured while our clocks had measured only 240 minutes. A differential that shouldn't be possible, but clearly was because the evidence was undeniable, written in white hair and weathered faces, and the haunted expressions of people who'd lost almost a week of their lives in an afternoon and couldn't explain where it had gone. I spent the next week interviewing each of the 4 climbers separately, documenting their accounts in detail that I hoped would reveal some rational explanation for what they'd experienced, even though I suspected no such explanation existed, because I'd seen the shadow pointing wrong myself, had watched it violate the basic physics that govern how light creates darkness. And if the shadow could break those rules, then maybe it could break temporal rules too, could create pockets where time moved at different rates, the way relativity predicts near massive gravitational sources, but shouldn't happen on a mountain that, however tall, doesn't have anywhere near the mass required to dilate time through conventional physics. Their accounts matched in the broad strokes, but diverged in the specific details, which is actually what you'd expect from genuine traumatic experience rather than coordinated fabrication, because memory doesn't record trauma cleanly, fragments it into pieces that different minds reconstruct differently while maintaining the core elements that made the event significant. All 4 reported the shadow pointing the wrong direction, toward the sun rather than away. All 4 reported the sensation of emptiness or thinness in the air within the shadow zone, like reality itself had less density there. All 4 reported time feeling wrong, moving at speeds that didn't match their internal sense of duration. And all 4 reported seeing something in the shadow, something that wasn't them and wasn't the mountain, but was there nonetheless, watching them, maybe following them, a presence that they couldn't describe clearly because it existed in the absence of light rather than in light, was defined by what it wasn't rather than what it was. It was like the shadow had a shadow, James told me during our 3rd interview, struggling to articulate an experience that language wasn't designed to capture, because language evolved to describe things that exist in normal physics, normal time, normal relationships between illumination and its absence. Something darker than the darkness, moving through it, and I had the sense that it was aware of us, that it was studying us the way you'd study something you were considering eating or absorbing or incorporating into yourself. I've been climbing for 25 years. I've encountered every danger these mountains can produce, but I've never felt hunted before. In the shadow, I felt hunted. Dr. Martin Voss arrived at Denali Base Camp 3 days after the incident, an atmospheric physicist from the University of Alaska Fairbanks who'd been studying light anomalies in the Alaska Range for 11 years and had accumulated a substantial body of evidence that something about Denali specifically didn't behave according to standard optical physics. He was 49, methodical, careful about his claims because he knew how easily scientists got dismissed as cranks when they reported phenomena that contradicted established understanding. And when I showed him my own documentation of the shadow pointing wrong, photographs with timestamps and solar position data that proved the shadow was falling in a direction inconsistent with where the sun was located, he didn't seem surprised, just nodded, and pulled out his own files that contained similar evidence going back over a decade. Denali's shadow has been anomalous since at least 1913, when the first successful summit expedition reported it, Voss explained, spreading photographs and data printouts across the table in the ranger station where we'd set up our investigation. Hudson Stuck's party documented the shadow falling toward the sun during their descent, but the observation was attributed to altitude sickness and disorientation and was removed from the official expedition report because it sounded too strange to be credible. Since then, every few years, climbers report similar phenomena: the shadow in the wrong place, the shadow moving independently of solar position, the shadow seeming to reach toward people rather than simply existing as the absence of light behind an opaque object. "What causes it?" I asked, looking at evidence that spanned a century and represented dozens of independent observations from experienced mountaineers who had no reason to fabricate or even exaggerate what they'd seen. What possible physical mechanism could make a shadow fall toward its light source? Voss hesitated, the careful hesitation of a scientist about to say something he couldn't fully support with data, but believed nonetheless, based on the accumulation of evidence that pointed toward a conclusion too strange to state confidently. "I don't think it's a shadow in the conventional sense," he said finally. "I think it's something else that looks like a shadow, that occupies the space where a shadow should be but isn't actually caused by the mountain blocking light. I think it's an independent phenomenon that uses the shadow zone as its location, its hunting ground, and it can move that zone wherever it wants, regardless of where the sun is, because it's not actually created by the sun's light being blocked." "You're saying the shadow is alive? That it's a creature or entity that just happens to look like darkness?" "I'm saying that what we call Mount McKinley's shadow might not be McKinley's shadow at all. Might be something that lives in that area and takes the form of shadow because that's how it exists in our dimension, as absence rather than presence, as the thing that's not there, rather than the thing that is. Indigenous peoples in this region have stories going back generations about what they call Nukatpiak Taryuk, which translates roughly to the shadow that hunts, or the hunting shadow, and they describe it almost exactly as our climbers described their experience: a darkness that moves wrong, that contains something aware and predatory, that takes things from people who enter it unprepared. Tyler Okalik was my partner ranger, 31 years old with 5 years of experience at Denali and something more valuable than experience: heritage. He was Inupiat, had grown up in Kotzebue on the northwest coast of Alaska, had learned the stories his grandmother told about the shadow that hunts, and the places where darkness wasn't just absence of light, but presence of something ancient that existed before light came to the world and resented its arrival. When I told him what Voss had said about Nukatpiak Taryuk, he nodded slowly with an expression that mixed validation and concern, pleased that outside knowledge was finally catching up to what his people had always known, but worried about what that knowledge meant for the climbers who kept entering the shadow zone without understanding what they were walking into. "My grandmother called it the hungry dark," Tyler said as we hiked toward the Kahiltna Glacier to take measurements in the shadow zone during what Voss had calculated would be peak anomaly conditions: the sun at an angle that should cast the shadow northeast, but which historical data suggested would actually cast it southwest, toward the sun, in that impossible configuration that broke physics as thoroughly as anything I'd encountered in my career. She said it was here before the sun existed, that when light first came to the world, the hungry dark retreated into the places where mountains blocked illumination, hiding from something it couldn't tolerate. But it never stopped being hungry, never stopped wanting to consume the things that light made possible: warmth, life, time itself. She said it ate time the way we eat food, that it needed duration to survive, and it took that duration from anything that entered its territory. "That matches what happened to James and his team," I said, thinking about the 6 days of biological time they'd lost to 4 hours of clock time, the way the shadow had apparently consumed their duration and left them aged and depleted, like something had fed on the time they should have experienced. "If this thing eats time, then people who enter the shadow lose time proportional to how long they're inside and how hungry the shadow is when they enter." "It's always hungry," Tyler said quietly. "That's what my grandmother said. It's been hungry since light first pushed it into hiding thousands of years ago, and it will stay hungry until it consumes enough time to become strong again, strong enough to push back against the light, to expand beyond the shadow zones and reclaim territory it lost when the sun first rose. Every person who enters feeds it. Every hour of duration it takes makes it stronger, and if enough people feed it over enough years... He didn't finish the sentence, but I understood the implication, that the shadow wasn't just a static phenomenon, but a growing one, something that was accumulating power through every temporal theft it committed, building toward some threshold where it would no longer need to hide in the zones where mountains blocked the sun, but could exist independently, could hunt wherever it wanted, could turn day into night by simply being present, the way it turned climbers' hours into its sustenance. We reached the shadow zone at 2:15 p.m., the point on the Kahiltna Glacier where Denali's shadow should have been falling based on the sun's position at approximately 215 degrees azimuth and 18 degrees elevation, southwest and low, which meant the shadow should extend northeast, away from the sun, across the glacier toward the peaks of the Alaska Range that lined the horizon in that direction. Instead, the shadow fell southwest toward the sun, creating a patch of darkness that seemed to reach for the light source rather than flee from it. And standing at the boundary of that shadow, I could feel what James had tried to describe: the emptiness, the thinness, the sense of reality having less substance inside the dark zone than outside it. Before I tell you what happened when Tyler and I entered that shadow zone, what we found inside, and what it cost us to find it, I need you to subscribe to this channel, because this is the kind of documentation you won't find anywhere else. Rangers and researchers telling the truth about phenomena that parks can't officially acknowledge because the implications are too strange for public safety messaging that depends on pretending nature is comprehensible, predictable, manageable. I've got 4 more locations to document after this one. 4 more parks where rangers are dealing with things that science doesn't explain and indigenous knowledge does. And if you want to understand what's really happening in America's wilderness, you need to follow this investigation because it's going to change how you think about shadows, about darkness, about what lives in the places where light doesn't reach. We entered the shadow together, Tyler and I, each carrying measurement equipment that Voss had provided. Light meters, thermometers, altimeters, synchronized chronometers that would let us compare the time we experienced inside the shadow with the time that passed outside it, giving us objective data on the temporal displacement that James and his team had reported subjectively, but that we needed to quantify if we were going to understand the phenomenon well enough to protect future climbers from it. The moment we crossed from light into darkness, I felt the change that James had struggled to describe. Not cold exactly, or not just cold, but empty in a way that went beyond temperature, like the air had been thinned of something essential, some quality that made it air rather than just gases, some substance that reality needed to feel real. "My chronometer is already drifting," Tyler said, holding up the device that should have been synchronized to atomic time and showing me a display where the seconds were counting too fast, 2 ticks for every one that should have elapsed, like time inside the shadow was moving at double speed relative to outside. "We've been in here for what feels like 30 seconds, and the chronometer shows over a minute. The displacement is immediate and significant." We documented everything we could as we moved deeper into the shadow zone. Temperature readings that dropped not gradually but in sudden steps, like we were passing through boundaries between different thermal environments. Light levels that didn't correlate with distance from the shadow's edge but fluctuated independently, getting darker and lighter in patterns that suggested something moving around us, blocking and unblocking whatever minimal illumination penetrated the darkness. Sound characteristics that changed from the normal acoustic environment of a glacier to something muffled and close, like the air was absorbing sound before it could travel far, keeping everything immediate and intimate and contained. And all through it, that sensation of being watched, of something aware of our presence and interested in it, studying us with attention that felt predatory even though we couldn't see anything to be afraid of, couldn't locate the source of the gaze we both felt on our backs and our faces and everywhere at once. 40 minutes into the shadow zone by our subjective sense of time, though the chronometers showed over 3 hours had passed in the outside world during that subjective 40 minutes, we found what I think we were meant to find, what the shadow wanted us to see because it served some purpose we didn't understand, but that must have benefited the entity that lived in this darkness and fed on the time of anyone who entered its territory. Bodies. We found bodies arranged in a circle on the glacier ice, 17 of them, preserved by cold in conditions that should have meant they'd been there for decades, based on the weathering of their equipment and clothing, parkas and boots and climbing gear from eras spanning what looked like the 1950s through the 1990s. People who'd entered this shadow zone across half a century and never come out, never been found by search teams, never appeared in the recovery statistics that every national park maintains for fatalities within their boundaries. They weren't decomposed despite the years or decades they must have been lying there. The cold would explain that, temperatures well below freezing that would preserve tissue indefinitely. But they weren't intact either, not in the way that cold preservation should leave them, because something was missing from each body, something that I couldn't immediately identify but that made them look incomplete, hollow, like shells that had been emptied of their essential contents. Their faces were frozen in expressions that weren't pain or fear but something closer to confusion, like they'd been trying to understand what was happening to them when they died and had never reached that understanding, had passed from life to death, still puzzled by the physics of a shadow that shouldn't exist, and a darkness that was taking something from them they couldn't name. "Their time," Tyler said quietly, kneeling beside one of the bodies, a woman in 1970s-era climbing gear whose face still showed the remnants of what must have been determination and strength, before whatever happened to her in this shadow had drained those qualities along with everything else. The shadow took all their time, not just hours or days, but their entire remaining duration, everything they would have experienced if they'd lived full lives. It consumed their futures and left the empty containers behind. I understood then what the shadow really was, what it did to people who stayed inside it too long. It didn't just displace time or steal hours. It devoured potential, consumed the duration that each person carried as their birthright, the years and decades they should have had ahead of them, feeding on futures that would now never happen because the shadow had eaten them, the way it had eaten these 17 climbers' tomorrows and next weeks and next years, until nothing remained but bodies that had been stripped of temporal possibility and left as husks, monuments to appetite that spanned not just the space of this glacier, but the time of everyone who'd ever made the mistake of walking into darkness that wasn't cast by the mountain, but lived there independently, anciently, hungrily. "We need to leave," I said, checking my chronometer and seeing that we'd now lost over 5 hours of outside time to our subjective 90 minutes inside the shadow, the displacement accelerating the deeper we went and the longer we stayed, like the entity was feeding more aggressively now that it had tasted us, had sampled our duration and found it appetizing. "If the rate keeps increasing, we'll lose days before we can get back to the boundary, and if we lose enough days—" I didn't need to finish because Tyler was already moving, both of us understanding that the bodies around us represented the end state of temporal consumption, what happened when the shadow took not just some of your time, but all of it. When it fed until there was nothing left to feed on, and the victim became an empty vessel preserved in ice as evidence of appetite that would never be satisfied because it had been hungry since before light existed, and would stay hungry until it had consumed enough duration to become something more than shadow, something that could exist in light as easily as darkness, something that could hunt anywhere rather than only in the zones where mountains blocked the sun. We ran toward the boundary, toward the line where shadow became light and where we hoped the temporal displacement would stop, would release us back into normal physics, where seconds lasted 1 second and minutes contained 60 of them, and time moved at the pace that biological processes expected, rather than the accelerated consumption rate that was aging us with every step we took, burning through our futures to feed an entity that had been doing this since the first humans wandered into its territory thousands of years ago, and probably longer, since before humans existed, since before anything existed that experienced time in ways that could be stolen and eaten and converted into whatever sustenance the shadow required. The boundary wasn't where we'd left it. The shadow had expanded while we were inside, pushed outward in every direction to encompass more glacier, more mountain, more territory that should have been illuminated by a sun that was now lower in the sky than it should have been based on when we'd entered. Late afternoon light when we'd entered at early afternoon, hours consumed not just from our subjective experience, but from the outside world as well. The shadow eating time in both directions, taking duration from inside itself and from outside simultaneously, like it was growing stronger, feeding faster, approaching some threshold that would let it expand further still. There, Tyler pointed toward a section of the boundary that hadn't moved as far, a narrow corridor of light that still penetrated close to where we were, maybe 200 meters away across glacier that we'd have to cross while the shadow pressed in from all sides and the entity that lived in the darkness watched us with attention. That felt like pressure on my skull, weight behind my eyes, something trying to get inside my head to see how much time I had left for it to take. We covered the distance in what felt like seconds, but what our chronometers, when we finally escaped into light and checked them, recorded as another 47 minutes of outside time lost, bringing our total temporal displacement to over 6 hours consumed from a subjective experience of maybe 2 hours inside the shadow, a ratio that meant the entity had taken 4 hours of our lives for every hour we'd actually experienced in its territory, had aged us and depleted us and fed on our futures while we walked and ran and desperately tried to escape before we ended up like the 17 bodies arranged in their circle of consumption, empty and preserved and waiting for someone to find them and understand what had happened to all the time they should have had. When we emerged from the shadow into the late afternoon sunlight that felt like being born again, like returning to a world where physics worked correctly and seconds lasted their proper duration and light meant safety rather than just illumination, I collapsed onto the snow and breathed air that tasted full again, substantial, real in a way that the air inside the shadow hadn't been. Tyler dropped beside me, and when I looked at him I could see that he'd aged too, not as dramatically as James and his team, maybe a few months rather than years, but visible nonetheless in new lines around his eyes and a gauntness in his face that hadn't been there when we'd entered the shadow zone 3 hours ago by our experience and 9 hours ago by the world's clocks, Bihini Takti Iki. Listen, I know this sounds like fiction. I know everything in your rational mind is rejecting the idea that a shadow can eat time, and that you can lose hours or days or years of your life to darkness that's hungry in ways that physics doesn't account for. But hit that like button right now if you've ever felt time move wrong, if you've ever had an experience where duration didn't match your internal sense of how long things should take, because that feeling might not be psychological, might not be your perception being inaccurate. Might be something taking small bites of your time in shadows you didn't realize were dangerous, and what I'm about to tell you about why Denali's shadow is growing and what happens when it grows enough is going to make you think differently about every shadow you walk through for the rest of your life. We reported everything to Doug Harkin that evening. The 17 bodies, the temporal displacement measurements, the shadow's expansion during our time inside it. All of it documented in detail that I hoped would finally force the Park Service to take action beyond the inadequate warnings and restrictions that were clearly failing to prevent experienced climbers from entering a phenomenon that had been consuming people for at least 70 years, based on the oldest equipment we'd seen on those preserved corpses. Doug listened to our full account, reviewed the chronometer data that showed objective evidence of temporal displacement, looked at photographs we'd taken of the bodies and the shadow boundary, and the instruments recording anomalies that shouldn't exist according to any physics textbook. And then he pulled out files that I should have expected but still felt shocked to see. Documentation going back to 1932, the year Denali National Park was established, showing that every chief ranger since then had known about the shadow phenomenon, had tracked disappearances that correlated with shadow zone entry, had maintained records of temporal anomalies reported by climbers who'd survived their encounters, and had kept all of it classified, because there was no way to warn the public about a danger that violated basic physics without causing panic and damaging the park's reputation and tourism revenue. 89 confirmed fatalities since 1932, Doug said, his voice heavy with the weight of institutional knowledge that hadn't prevented a single death because the institution's primary response had been concealment rather than protection. That's just the ones we've found bodies for or had strong evidence about. The actual number is probably 2 or 3 times that. Climbers who disappeared on the mountain and were assumed to have fallen into crevasses or been buried by avalanches when really they'd walked into the shadow and never walked out because the entity inside took everything they had, every second of every year they should have lived, and left them as empty as those 17 you found today. Why isn't this public knowledge? I demanded, feeling anger rising at the decades of preventable deaths. The families who'd never known what really happened to their loved ones, the ongoing risk to every climber who attempted Denali without understanding that the mountain's shadow was a predator that would consume their futures if they gave it the opportunity. Why are we still letting people climb into that thing without telling them what it really is? Because what would we tell them? That the shadow eats time? That there's an entity living in the darkness that feeds on human duration? We'd be laughed out of every scientific and governmental institution that funds and supports this park, and we'd be sued by every family who thought we were making up stories to cover negligence or incompetence. The only way to manage this is quietly, restricting access to the shadow zones during peak anomaly periods, monitoring climbers' routes to intercept anyone heading toward dangerous areas, recovering bodies when we can, and attributing the deaths to conventional mountain hazards. It's not perfect. It's not even good. But it's the only approach that lets us continue operating while minimizing casualties. Minimizing isn't eliminating, Tyler said, his voice carrying the anger that I felt, but that he expressed more openly because his people had been dealing with this entity for generations before the park existed, had lost community members to the hungry dark long before white mountaineers started climbing Denali and adding their bodies to the collection that the shadow was apparently maintaining, for what purpose we didn't know, but that probably served its feeding somehow, maybe drawing more climbers to investigate the way we'd been drawn, creating a cycle of consumption that fed itself. 89 deaths that you know about, probably 200 or more that you don't, and the shadow is growing. We measured its expansion today. It's pushing outward, taking more territory, and if it keeps growing eventually, it won't just be a zone on the mountain. It'll be the whole mountain, and then the whole range, and then... He stopped because the implication was clear and terrifying. That the shadow was accumulating power through every death, every consumed future, every hour and day and year of human duration that it devoured and converted into expansion, into strength, into the ability to push beyond the zones where it had been confined since light first forced it into hiding, and to reclaim the world that had belonged to darkness before illumination existed, before anything existed that could cast shadows rather than being shadow, before the fundamental distinction between light and its absence that made reality comprehensible to creatures like us who lived in the light and thought we understood what darkness was when really we had no idea, had never conceived that darkness could be hungry and patient and growing stronger while we fed it with our time and our lives and our futures. Dr. Voss proposed a monitoring system that would track the shadow's boundaries over time, measuring its expansion rate and correlating that rate with climbing activity to determine how much each consumed climber contributed to the entity's growth, data that might let us predict when the shadow would reach critical thresholds and take actions to prevent those thresholds from being crossed, even though none of us knew what actions would actually be effective against a phenomenon that existed outside physics, as we understood it, and probably outside any intervention we could devise. We installed sensors around the current shadow boundary, cameras that would record its movement, instruments that would measure temporal displacement at various distances from the edge to map the gradient of consumption from minimal time loss at the periphery to total temporal annihilation at the center, where the 17 bodies waited in their circle for more company. The data we gathered over the following weeks confirmed our worst fears. The shadow was expanding at an accelerating rate, growing faster each month than it had the month before, pushing outward in all directions but especially toward the climbing routes that brought the most traffic, like it was deliberately positioning itself to intercept the maximum number of potential victims, optimizing its hunting ground for the prey that fed it. At current rates of expansion, Voss calculated that the shadow would encompass the entire standard West Buttress climbing route within 18 months, making it impossible to summit Denali without passing through temporal displacement zones that would steal hours or days or potentially years from anyone who attempted the climb, and impossible to descend without the same exposure, meaning every climber would lose time going up and coming down, would emerge from their expedition aged and depleted and missing futures they'd never experience. I need you to drop a comment and tell me what you think we should do with this information, because I'm genuinely asking, do we close the mountain entirely, prevent anyone from climbing Denali, and accepting the economic and cultural impact of shutting down one of North America's most iconic mountaineering destinations? Do we warn climbers about temporal displacement and let them make informed decisions about risking their futures for a summit experience? Do we try to fight the shadow somehow? Attempt to push it back or destroy it even though we don't understand what it is or whether it can be harmed by anything we might do? I've been thinking about this constantly since we emerged from that shadow zone with hours of our lives missing and aging on our faces that we'll never get back. And I don't have answers, just questions that keep me awake at night while the shadow keeps growing, and the body count keeps rising, and the entity that lives in the darkness keeps feeding on duration, that should have belonged to people with futures and families and plans that will never happen now because they walked into a shadow that was pointing the wrong direction and didn't walk out again. We implemented emergency protocols, mandatory shadow zone avoidance for all climbing expeditions, real-time monitoring of shadow boundaries with alerts when expansion approached climbing routes, required temporal displacement briefings for every climber who registered for a Denali attempt, informing them in vague terms about anomalous conditions that could affect their experience of time without explicitly saying that a hungry entity would eat their futures if they wandered into the wrong patch of darkness. The protocols reduced casualties but didn't eliminate them because climbers are risk-takers by nature, people who accept danger as the price of achievement, and telling them that a shadow might steal their time wasn't enough to deter everyone, wasn't enough to overcome the summit fever that drove people to attempt the tallest mountain in North America, regardless of warnings that probably sounded like superstition or exaggeration, or liability protection, rather than literal description of a phenomenon that would consume their remaining years if they gave it access. James Whitfield never climbed again after his experience in the shadow zone. The 6 days of biological time he'd lost to 4 clock hours having aged him enough that his body couldn't handle the physical demands of high-altitude mountaineering anymore. His joints stiff and his endurance diminished, and his hair white in ways that made him look 70 rather than 43, decades stolen from him that he'd never recover, and that had fed the entity's growth by whatever amount 6 days of human duration translated to in terms of shadow expansion. He speaks at climbing clubs now, warning people about Denali's shadow, telling them his story in terms that stop short of explicitly claiming the mountain hosts a time-eating entity, but that make clear something took years of his life in hours of climbing, and that anyone who ignores the warning risks the same fate or worse. I still work at Denali, still patrol the boundaries of a shadow that keeps growing despite our protocols, still recover bodies when climbers ignore warnings and walk into darkness they don't walk out of. Still measure my own time carefully because I lost hours to the shadow that day with Tyler, and I feel those hours missing. Feel the gap in my duration that represents feeding I didn't consent to, and that the entity took anyway, because that's what it does, what it's been doing since before humans existed, and what it will keep doing until it's consumed enough time to break free of the shadow zones entirely and hunt in light as easily as darkness. The shadow falls in the wrong direction every day, pointing toward the sun instead of away from it, reaching for the light that pushed it into hiding, and that it's slowly building the strength to overcome through every climber it consumes, every future it devours, every year of human duration it converts into the expansion that brings it closer to the threshold. Doug and Voss and Tyler and I all fear, but don't know how to prevent. The point where the shadow stops being a zone on the mountain and starts being the mountain itself. Then the range, then the state, then the continent, then the world. Darkness reclaiming territory. It lost when light first existed, and that it never stopped hungering to possess again. If you climb Denali, if you attempt the tallest peak in North America and walk the routes that bring you near the shadow zones we've marked and warned about and tried to steer people away from, watch the direction the shadow falls because it will tell you whether you're safe or whether you've entered territory that belongs to something that wants your time more than you want your summit. Something that will take your future and leave your body preserved in ice as evidence of appetite that spans not just this mountain, but the entire history of darkness, resenting light and waiting for the chance to push back against it. The shadow that hunts is real. The hungry dark is growing, and every hour it consumes makes it stronger while making us weaker, stealing futures that should have contained lives and loves and experiences that will never happen now because they fed something ancient and patient and very, very hungry. Mount McKinley's shadow falls in the wrong direction because it isn't McKinley's shadow at all. It's a predator wearing shadow as camouflage, hiding in the absence of light while it builds the strength to exist in light. And when it finally crosses that threshold, when the accumulated time of all its victims finally gives it what it needs to hunt beyond the darkness, there won't be shadows to avoid anymore, because the whole world will be its hunting ground, and nowhere will be safe from an entity that eats duration the way we breathe air, constantly and necessarily, and without any possibility of stopping until there's nothing left to consume. We just try to minimize how much we feed it, try to keep climbers out of its territory, try to slow its growth while we look for ways to stop it entirely that we haven't found yet and might never find, because we're fighting something that existed before physics and doesn't have to follow rules that came after it, that predate our understanding and will outlast our species unless we figure out how to push back against darkness that's been hungry since before time itself existed. The shadow is growing, the shadow is hunting, and the shadow is pointing the wrong direction because it's reaching for the light it intends to consume along with everything else. Stay in the light while you still can.